20 years ago today, the Arizona Diamondbacks evened things up with the New York Yankees in the 2001 World Series, forcing a decisive Game 7. For an eventful score of 15-2, it really was an uneventful game after the third inning. We don't want to talk about the game necessarily, but what happened after the game with Pedro Gomez, longtime ESPN reporter and at the time columnist for the Arizona Republic. Pedro passed away last February, but his longtime friend and fellow ESPN reporter TJ Quinn remembers the column that Pedro wrote heading into Game 7 that few would be courageous enough to write. You were covering the Yankees for the New York Daily News at the time, but can you give me a sense of what it was like for that World Series? The Diamondbacks leave Bank One Ballpark after Game 2 feeling pretty darn good. They go to New York, drop 3 games in very dramatic fashion. What was the sense of the World Series at that point heading into Game 6?
Well, the defining thing of the series up to that point was really the energy in Yankee Stadium. I mean, that was everyone coming back there. You'd had the division series and the ALCS in Yankee Stadium, of course, all post 9/11. But the World Series was different, and the energy every day was unbelievable. And then the Yankees win 2 games in extra innings. And look, I've been in extra inning games. I've been to World Series games. I've never seen anything with that kind of emotion. I don't think people can get more whipped up than they were. And with the way that stadium felt after games 3 and 4, you thought there's just no way they lose again. And the one thing in the back of your mind, though, was the Diamondbacks have Johnson and Schilling coming up, and everyone knew, just how much that changed the scenario. Momentum is great, but then you had a travel day, and now you're back in Arizona, and I think that was you had if the series had continued in Yankee Stadium, I don't know if they ever lose. But getting that day off, coming back, and it also, just from a baseball sense, it let the Diamondbacks kind of reset. I mean, their offense had been nothing up to that point. I mean, I had to go look at it again. I'd forgotten that, after Game 1, where they just sort of drubbed Mike Mussina, the only runs they had over the next 4 games were a couple of home runs. And that was it. They weren't manufacturing. Nobody was getting on. And Bob Brenly was in a really tough spot about what do I do with these guys. Tony Womack was, I think, 3 for 23 going into, or 3 for 21 going in that game. Craig Counsell was I think 1 for 20. You had these crucial guys who just weren't doing anything, and there was pressure on him to shake up the lineup. So with Game 6, Yankees have a ton of faith in Pettit, and Womack leads off the game with a hit, and you're like, okay, maybe he broke out of it. Something's different. The killer to me was Randy Johnson got a hit, and then you realize, okay, everybody is hitting this game. They get 22 hits, not one home run. It was just this complete flip of what was going on.
And so Diamondbacks cruise to a 15-2 win. Yes, a very eventful third inning, but really, in terms of what happened on the field in that series, that is kind of a relatively uneventful game. But what happened after the game and leading into Game 7 is one of the reasons I really wanted to talk to you with Pedro Gomez. He was a longtime, baseball and reporter for ESPN. I know you're very good friends with him. At the time, he was working for the Arizona Republic as a columnist. In his column leading into Game 7, he mentioned that for Game 4, Bob Brenly ended up pulling Curt Schilling. Curt Schilling had said something along the lines of, "Don't hang me out there." And then Bong-Young Kim comes in, gives up that 2-run home run. And then after the game, Schilling said he had more left in the tank. Before Game 7, he reported that Schilling had said, "Yeah, my arm's sore," and kind of created a no-lose situation for him to go into Game 7. If he pitched great, he's a hero. If he doesn't, well, he has a sore arm. So he writes that, or you hear that he's going to write that column. And that's something, it was, I remember it was pretty tense in Arizona going into that game 7. What were your thoughts knowing that this was probably going to be a pretty highly scrutinized column going into the biggest day in Arizona sports history?
Well, I had been with Pedro earlier in the playoffs in Atlanta when they had their series against the Braves, and we're in a bar in Bucktown. It's about 1 a.m. There's another friend of ours, especially guy Pedro's been friends with since high school, who's an FBI agent, who's very intense guy, great guy, and a couple guys in Diamondback shirts started getting into it with Pedro, and Pedro was, look, he could write tough, but he was never a flamethrower. He was never someone doing it just to get energy, and he had never really. He wasn't somebody who was out there killing the Diamondbacks. He just would write, very straight news about here's what's good, here's what's bad. And that's the whole point of being a fan, is that you don't want to hear any of the bad. And these guys were kind of getting into it with him, saying, can't you write just one positive thing? And Pedro's being Pedro about it. He's like, hey, look, it's not about that. It's, I'm not attacking the team. I'm whatever. And I'm getting mad. Our friend Jose is getting really angry. And Pedro's turning to me saying, we got to get him out of here. Something bad is going to happen. And so it's on my mind about how fans were already looking at Pedro as the lead voice on this for the Arizona Republic. And so you knew he was a target, and like nothing happened with those guys, but it's just a couple of jerks in a bar who recognize him. And so now we're going into game 7, the first professional championship of any team in the state of Arizona, potentially. There's a lot riding on this, and he was just livid with the way Schilling had conducted himself. And this wasn't new. I mean, Kurt had been that way in Philly. Everybody knew about it. It was no secret in baseball. And here he is essentially creating the situation like you just put it. He can't lose. If he pitches, he's the hero because he overcame, this arm injury and went out there. And if he loses, well, what am I supposed to do? I was hurt. And other guys weren't doing that, God, who was it? I think Gonzalez had been hit on the wrist. And that was is a really rough injury. And he wasn't complaining when people would ask him about it. He's like, no, I'm fine. I'm going in. And, Pedro felt like for the guys who just understood what this moment was and what they needed to do for each other in the clubhouse, the idea that Schilling would leave his manager out like that would, it was that classic 24+1 scenario. And he decides that night, I've got to rip him, because just the position that he's put the team in. And he talked to, we went off to write. Everyone was doing their things. I think I went back to the hotel and I got a call from, it's Pedro, his wife, Sandy, and our friend, Steve Ketman. And, because they just wanted one more person to talk to about should he do this or not. And to be honest, I was kind of on the fence, like, are you sure you want to do this, man? You really want to draw that kind of fire to yourself? And he was just so sure, like, no, this is what I want to do. And this is the right thing to do. And he felt like this was the honest piece to write about Schilling. And so he killed him and just said that, the way he conducts himself, that, the classic, what was the quote in the piece? He's the classic table for one. He felt like he had to do it. And I woke up the next morning with a knot in my stomach. I mean, it wasn't my byline over this story, but I'm like, this really might not go well.
He knew he was going to get hammered for that. And still, but that was the right thing to him. Can you just kind of expand upon that and how that drove Pedro? Because even knowing him 20 years later, that's how he operated, whenever he'd show up at the Cardinals or the Diamondbacks or an all-star game or whatever it may be.
Yeah. I mean, he was not particularly thick-skinned. He really wasn't. He wasn't like one of those guys who could just, I'm going to rip the hell out of somebody and whatever people say, they say, great. Some people feed off that. He didn't. I mean, criticism bothered him. which is to me what made him, genuinely courageous, because he hated for people to be angry with him, to be upset with him. Pedro was, one of the most engaging, warm people you ever meet in your life. I mean, you really, this isn't something where you just gush about somebody after they die. I mean, Pedro was that person. And so we get to the ballpark kind of early, and excuse me, I see him in the press box. I said, "How you doing?" And he goes, "Yeah, well, okay." He said, "Come here." And he starts to play his voicemail from work. And these are just flat out racist attacks. And, guy, calling him horrible names. And the one laugh he had was somebody called him something that you would typically say to deeply offend someone who's Mexican, and Pedro's Cuban. And he's, just can't even get the nationality right. It was, but it landed. He was really upset about it, and he could crack jokes, but at the same time, he knew that there was some real vitriol out there. And so he looks at me and said, "I need to go down there, don't I?" And I said, "Yeah." And I said, "Can I go with you?" He's like, "Yeah." And he just knew the rule that if you write something, if you're going to take a shot, you are there to be accountable, that you don't just hit and run. And so we went downstairs, we walked out onto the field. It was during the Diamondbacks batting practice. Couldn't go in the clubhouse like you usually would, but he just wanted to be there in case anybody had anything to say. And we just kept walking back and forth in foul territory, from toward first base to third base and back. And he's, pretty cool about the whole thing. We're just chatting like we normally would, but I've got an eye on the crowd, just, in case somebody recognizes him, because they probably would. And I, again, I don't tend to be too dramatic on this sort of thing, but you also knew over the course of the night, if he's going to interact with fans, if someone's going to get in his face at a bar before he writes this piece, and now he's ripping the starter of Game 7, who knows what someone's going to do? Is someone going to take a swing at him? Is someone going to throw a beer? I had no idea, but we're standing there, and the pitchers who were shagging in the outfield start coming off the field. And Greg Swindell, he's in uniform, and he's walking past, and he sees us and stops, heads straight toward Pedro. And he sticks his hand out and shakes his hand and gives him this huge nod and doesn't say a word, just utter respect and recognition. And then he turned and went back into the dugout. And Pedro turned to me, and his face was just lit up. He said, "Did you see that?" I said, "Yeah, I saw that." And it changed everything, just because he knew, okay, that, someone I respect in the clubhouse, someone who gets it, thinks I did the right thing. And he wasn't doing it to please Greg Swindell. He wasn't doing it to curry favor with anybody else. Again, I'm telling you, this guy was one of my closest friends. He did it because it was right. But the fact that someone on the team was willing to make that public gesture saying, "You got it right," it meant the world to him. And it really kind of, whatever else happened the rest of that day, yeah, people yelled stuff, and he got a lot of nasty letters and emails, and this is pre-social media. God knows what Twitter would have done with it. But
gosh,
I don't even want to think about it. But he just gave him that comfort. He knew it was right.
So he gets that instant validation, in your essay, in the book, Remember Who You Are, what Pedro Gomez showed us about baseball and life. You said he got plenty of backpats in the press box, in the journalism world. That's, it's easy to get that validation, but getting that validation from the player, he got that immediately. But now, 20 years removed, looking back and seeing that column and that moment and all the context is there, how does that almost add to the legend of this column and Pedro?
It became, I don't know that he ever thought of it this way. Maybe we did, if you sat back and thought about it at the time, but that it was going to be this sort of one of those moments that defines your career. Because when it came to, and that's one of the biggest events he's going to cover. He's the local guy for, the Arizona paper, when his team is in game 7 and he is holding the ace of the team or one of the co-aces to task. And everybody in that business, when Pedro died, it was one of the first things you heard people in the business talk about, was because he just rose to that moment. And, again, people say, oh, he was fearless. No, he was not fearless. He was courageous, but he was not fearless. He did have fear. And, which to me made it much more poignant, I think. Just you get those few chances in your career where there's a real test of what you're about. And he was about, no, I'm going to write what my heart tells me I need to write. I'm going to write what I think is the right thing. And it was incredible how 20 years later, 19 years later, people still remembered that. And it shaped how people in the business looked at him, that he wasn't just a good guy. I mean, there are a lot of good guys. And it's one thing to be remembered that way, but it's another when, no, the legacy you leave is I did it right. And not only in how he handled the column and how he wrote it, but the way he made himself accountable and walked out there and showed, I will stand by what I did and I'll take whatever's coming to me.
TJ, thank you so much for sitting down with us and recounting that. And, just such a great trip down memory lane, not to even, a great series, but also remembering, Pedro in a huge moment in his life.
It remains one of the biggest of mine, and I was just a spectator. But no, it's I appreciate it, and it's I love any chance to talk about him that I can get.